I'm now joined again from California in the United States by Professor Barry Mcdonald, who's Professor of Constitutional Law at Pepperdine University. Professor Mcdonald, thank you very much for joining me today on aNews.
Thank you for having me.
Now, today is an auspicious occasion in the United States, the election of either re-election of the incumbent president or the election of a new president. I believe Donald Trump is the 45th president since the Constitution of the United States was put in place. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. So let's go back to that very beginning. What is the role of the Constitution? We hear of the importance that America places on its Constitution. Most people outside of the US actually just understand it very vaguely. But why is it such an important thing for Americans, and an entire field of law is dedicated to it? Can you explain that? Can you explain in broad terms for us?
Yes. Well, the Constitution of the United States was adopted about 230 years ago, and it creates the basic blueprint of our national government, and it lays out the structure of the national government, the three different branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, as well as individual rights. It has a Bill of Rights. And, the reason it's a whole field of law here in the United States is because it's a fairly short document. When it was penned, it was only 3.5 pages of parchment paper. Mm-hmm. And so it's phrased in very broad and general language that rarely answers a concrete dispute that may arise today. And so that's why the court system in the United States, and particularly the U.S. Supreme Court, exists to, when there is a dispute, to interpret the Constitution and determine exactly how it should apply to a situation. And over time, those decisions fill volumes and volumes and volumes of books that we call constitutional law, the decisions interpreting what the Constitution means. But at bottom, our constitutional law are the written provisions of that short document that underlay all of those cases.
So what is the particular relevance of the U.S. Constitution to today's election? You mentioned the three branches. Is that all tied up together?
Oh, yes, it is, because in the sections of the Constitution that create our Congress and that create our office of the president, it also determines how, the Congress is going to be composed, and how the elections, will occur in terms of electing members of the House of Representatives in Congress every 2 years, electing members of the United States Senate every 6 years, and then electing a person to fill the office of the president every 4 years.
And so for those three bodies, the two bodies and the president, the Senate, the Congress, and the presidency, those are all on the docket for today for certain seats. That's correct, isn't it? I know that.
Well, all of the House seats and the presidency is, of course, on the ballot. In terms of the 100 senators, there are 2 from each state, and the Constitution provides that 1/3 of the Senate will be up for re-election every 2 years, and so only 1/3 of the senators are up for election in this go-round.
And of course, we just the third branch, the judiciary, has just seen a new member elected in the last few days. So with Amy Coney Barrett. So it's all change at the top, one might say. Does this create a sense of tension in itself?
Well, what's created tension is the way that both the Republican-dominated Senate as well as President Trump have worked together to appoint two of the last three Supreme Court justices. The first one was, right at the beginning, well, even before President Trump was elected, when President Obama was in office, we had one of the justices die, and President Obama nominated a person to fill that seat, but the Republican Senate obstructed that nomination. And so after the President Trump surprisingly won the election, he was able to fill that seat, and the Democrats feel that that seat was stolen from them because of the obstruction by the United States Senate and the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. And then in this latest election where Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and I should say in this latest Supreme Court vacancy where Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, it was 4 or 5 weeks before the election, and so a lot of people argued that instead of President Trump filling that seat, he should wait to see who was going to win the presidential election and let the new president fill the seat. But of course, he didn't agree with that, and the Republican Senate and him rammed through the Justice Barrett nomination, and so there was a lot of tension because of that as well.
So has this particular election thrown up any questions that constitutional law experts like yourself are asking?
Well, we're just hoping the Constitution lays out the basic mechanisms for what happens if we have what's called an electoral college that's built into the Constitution. And under that electoral college, a president has to get a certain number of electoral votes in order to be president. And what happens in the Constitution if a president does not get a majority of those electoral votes, the Constitution provides that then the disputed election will go into the House of Representatives for the House of Representatives in Congress to decide who is going to be president. But there's a lot of, because under the Constitution, the various states run the time, place, and manners of their elections. A lot of election disputes arise because of state law. Right. And so that brings the courts into sort of the election battles. And so, everyone is just hoping that we don't have a lot of those state law election disputes that are going to sort of interfere with the general process that the Constitution provides for electing a new president.
Can you explain for us, because I generally don't understand, the state law has its own, seems to have its own sovereignty, and of course above that there's the federal law. Oftentimes these seem to come either into conflict with each other, or how does this work in the United States?
Well, so most of election law is built on the independent law of the 50 states. For example, how votes are going to be cast, how votes are going to be counted. And if there's a dispute about that, it's resolved under the law of the particular state. But overlaying all of that state law is a thin layer of supreme federal law, and particularly the constitutional right to cast a vote. And so if, for example, the U.S. Supreme Court, a majority of the justices were to believe that the way that the state courts or even federal courts were, well, it's mainly the state courts, the way that state courts were interpreting and applying the state election laws, if they thought it was being done in a way that was too injurious to the federal constitutional right to be able to cast a vote, that sort of gives federal courts, and in particular the U.S. Supreme Court, some justification for sort of supervising how state election law disputes are resolved.
That's very interesting, and in that sense, also the Electoral College, which you mentioned, it's 538 members of the Electoral College, I believe. The states have an allocation. Has that allocation changed over time? No doubt the demographics of the different states have changed. How is the Electoral College formed, the number of places given out to each state? And does it need updating for 2020?
Well, the allocation of the Electoral College, the Constitution provides that it's based on the number of representatives in Congress that a state is entitled to. And the number of representatives is based on the population of the state. So, of course, the bigger states like California, Texas, New York, they're going to have the most Electoral College votes. And the smaller states, of course, are going to have the smallest number of Electoral College votes. And so, so basically the candidates for president have to win the presidency on a state-by-state basis and hope to get enough states and their electoral votes to put them over the magic 270 number to give them a majority of electoral votes to be elected presidents.
Now, this election has been different, I'm certain, from any election that's ever been held in the United States for many reasons. It's become particularly polarized, hasn't it? And even today, a literal wall's been thrown up around the White House because of a fear of demonstrations in the nation's capital, and there are fears of other protests around the country. Do you think that this is the biggest political divide the US has ever seen, or is it just something that's been hyped up?
Well, I don't know if it's the biggest divide we've ever seen, because we've had a pretty big divides in our history, but it's certainly the biggest divide that I've seen in my lifetime, in the last 50 years or so. And I think the divided election is just a symptom of how divided the country has become. And it's really been accelerated over the past 4 years, I have to be honest, under the administration of Donald Trump. And I think the reason for that is that Trump is one of the few presidents in our history. In fact, he may be the only one that has ever seen sort of the role of the president as to sort of represent one party, the Republican Party. He sort of paints the White House as, either you're with us, you're a Republican, you're from a red state, or you're against us, you're a Democrat, and you're from a blue state. And the founders never envisioned the presidency to be like that. First of all, the founders never envisioned these sorts of two dominant political parties emerging and being constantly at war with each other. And secondly, the founders saw the president as a unifying force to bring all Americans together. And that's historically, all of our presidents have seen the presidency in that way, whether they're a Republican or whether they're a Democrat. They see themselves as the president of all American citizens, regardless of their political persuasions. But for some reason that I can't understand, this president just doesn't seem to get that. He sees him as, we're going to win this. We, the Republicans, are going to win this, and we're going to beat, the other half of America, and we're going to rule for the next 4 years. And I think that sort of, in the last 4 years, have been characterized by that sort of divisive attitude, that we aren't just one American family. We are sort of a divided house. And, as Jesus said long ago, a house divided amongst itself cannot stand. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we're experiencing this tremendous polarization over the last 4 years.
And as a constitutional expert, that must be particularly painful, as I think the Constitution says that the president is for the people.
And certainly the founders believe that, the president being elected by the Electoral College, drawn from individuals across the country, the founders thought that the president was simply going to represent all American citizens. After all, the federal government exists to, represent American citizens in areas where one unified voice and policy is necessary, like, for example, in areas of national defense, international trade, foreign policy. And so the federal government was really created to develop uniform positions in areas where it's essential to a healthy and thriving country.
Of course, the Founding Fathers didn't have the disadvantage of social media to stir things up. But joking aside, one of the very interesting things to have happened prior to today is that over 100 million people have voted already before the 3rd of November in early elections, either post-elections or in-person early voting. So whilst there is a lot of polarisation in the country, there also seems to be a great fervour, a great passion for people to place their votes. So does this perhaps give a positive sign for the future?
Well, if it indicated a lasting engagement by American citizens to become informed and about what's going on and cast their votes, if it's a long-standing thing, I would say it's a good and positive development. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing is that voters are going to the polls because there's a lot of angst and worry about the state of our country and where it's going. And, the Republicans sort of have one vision for that, and the Democrats have another vision for that. What we're lacking is a leader to unify those visions and to say, look, we have a lot of common ground here as Americans. That's, I think, what we're missing. And I think people are turning out early to vote, et cetera, because there is so much anxiety and angst. And so I'm not hopeful that, once we get past this, and I do believe we will get past this tumultuous period, but once we get past it, I hope that American citizens will stay engaged and engaged and become informed and cast votes at the level we're seeing today. But based on past history, I'm not completely optimistic about that.
Well, as one of America's favorite musical characters said, the sun will come up tomorrow, as I'm sure it will. But let me get back to one final question. Let's come back to the constitutional law question. There's a lot of speculation as to whether either candidate will concede the other's win after today's election is wrapped up, unless a landslide victory occurs. What do you think will happen? Could this get out of hand?
I know there's a lot of talk, and and there's been a lot of protests throughout the country on various issues in the last couple of years. I have no doubt that if there's a contested election, that we will see more of those protests. But democracy is messy, and we've always handled those kind of protests, and I'm sure we'll be able to manage through them now. And the great thing about America is that we have a strong, independent judiciary that people do have confidence in. And so I think that, if the election is contested, I think the American people have confidence that the courts will be able to sort it out in a fair way. At least I'm hoping that that's the case. My only hope is that, the courts don't get too involved. For example, in 2000, when there was a contested election between George Bush and Al Gore, a lot of people felt that the U.S. Supreme Court sort of preemptorily ended the election counting and installed George Bush as president. And the Supreme Court took a lot of heat for that. And so I'm hoping that the Supreme Court learned its lesson, that the judges and courts do exist to resolve, the technical voting disputes that arise along the way. But after they've done that, they get out of the way and let the Constitution do its work. And either at the end of the day, if there's a president that has a majority of the electoral votes, then that person will become president. But if they don't, then it'll go into the House of, I'm hoping it will go into the House of Representatives, the way that the Constitution provides, and the president will be smoothly elected then. I have no doubt that we'll have protests, throughout this whole process. We've always have, but again, protests aren't necessarily a bad thing for democracy. They sort of allow people a vehicle to sort of vent their frustrations, as long as they don't devolve into violence and looting. And that's unfortunate that some of them have.
Yes.
But I do think that we have the law enforcement mechanisms to keep that from happening on a widespread scale. So at the end of the day, I think we will get through this, and we will have a president that where the American people accept the results of the election.
And as you say, at the end of the day, it comes right back to square one, with the Constitution in place to support the procedures moving forward, with the separate branches playing their parts.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for your contributions today, Barry Mcdonald. That was very interesting. Thank you for joining us on aNews.
Thank you for having me.